For that lovely introduction. It makes me sound quite busy and and successful, let's put it that way. And it's nice to actually sort of hear back on a lot of the things that I've been doing and sort of think about how that relates to what I'll be presenting today. So yes, as was introduced, I'm now a lecturer in sociology at the University of Lincoln. I've been working there for the last 6 months. But the research that I'll be presenting today took place at the University of Leeds, and was Leverhulme Trust funded, an early career fellowship, Leverhulme Trust funded piece of research. And when Paula and it was Robert Hagan got in touch with me to present about my work, I sort of bit your hands off a little bit really, because it's really nice to be able to look at that data and to really sort of link it back to my past interests, if you like. So there's always been a bit of a thread, as was introduced, but in terms of thinking about the data that I've got and I've been generating at the moment, thinking around ageing male identities has kind of been a bit secondary actually. So as I say, it's been nice to sort of relook at that data with a slightly different lens, and to think about ageing masculinities and think about how we might conceptualise that and theorise that by thinking about men with different care responsibilities, and also men who are ageing but are not necessarily considered to be old, and I'll talk a bit more about that as the presentation unfolds. Just to give you a brief outline, so my plan initially is to give an overview of my research background, and to just give you a bit of context to the kind of thinking and the kind of research that I've been doing and I'm interested in doing. So I'll give a brief overview of research about grandfathers, around older men, and also around alternative masculinities, with a particular focus on caring and ageing masculinities. So as was said, my PhD was on grandfathers. This is a really limited research area, and one that I've been really keen to kind of be part of and to contribute to. And I think there's a lot more work that can be done in that regard. I'll give you a brief history then of my research, with a particular focus on my Leverhulme Trust funded sample that research study, introduce you to the sample of men that I'll be talking about and sharing some of their data. These are men who are kinship carers, and we'll talk through a bit about kinship care as well. And tomorrow I'll be doing a talk about their experiences of being kinship carers. I provide some very brief reflections on their experiences of being a kinship carer, and also think a little bit about the importance of health and social care intervention and involvement of families over time as well. But I'll talk about that in much more detail in tomorrow's session, but just to give you an overview there. So my starting point really, as I say, was my research with grandfathers. I originally started doing my PhD to look at intergenerational relationships between men. So I was really interested in the role of men in families, in informal care, as an area that hasn't really received much research attention. And this was around 2007 to 2011 when I finished my PhD. I ended up going to Sweden and was funded to go there for 6 weeks to work with the Jessa Research Centre there, which have interest in gender. They were running a conference at the time that was led by Jeff Hearn, and were interested in looking at research around ageing masculinities. So that really shaped my PhD and made me sort of think about what I would focus on and what empirical or substantive area I wanted to know more about. So I looked at intergenerational relations, but from the perspective of older men who are grandfathers. From that, I've been able to publish lots of papers, so in gender, place and culture, in sociology, with Robin Mann and other colleagues. And that's kind of a very small group of researchers, group of us who are presenting and publishing in that area. And recently, Anne Buchanan's just published a really interesting book on grandfathers. She was on Thinking Aloud recently on Radio 4, and was arguing that her impetus for researching grandfathers was because the Grandparents Plus were presenting and had said that we know very little about their experiences. So that was her impetus. And again, the similar reasons as me, really. And one of her key findings, and one that resonates with my own, was around the role of changing gender roles and how they play a part in grandfather involvement. So in my data, there was a lot of discussion around having lots of time to spend time with grandchildren, to be really involved in things like nappy changing, domestic labour, if you like, and as I say, to sort of really being nurturing actually in their relationships with their grandchildren.
Can I just interrupt? Sorry, just for 1 second for our colleagues at the remote points. We will have Anna's slides.
Yeah.
We can distribute
Sorry,
them
I am speaking to
afterwards
us, yeah.
if that's helpful. I know you can't see the screen, so but we will have copies of her slides, okay? Sorry.
That's right, no problem. Yes, so there is much more involvement, and Robin Mann talks about a new grandfatherhood that aligns with this kind of more involved fatherhood and those kind of cultural ideas about how men's practices and care practices are changing. But also within that data, there's a lot of contradiction as well. So there was still a lot of discussion around these kind of traditional gendered roles. So the men in my study were talking a lot about, you know, we do a bit more nappy changing, and we're asked to do nappy changing. We sometimes offer to do it, and even if we're not expected to. But they still talk in very gendered terms. So a lot of them talk about being the DIY grandfather. They talk about fixing things, doing things, and they subscribe to those kind of traditional gendered roles through their discussions about their practices. So there's this sort of contradiction, if you like, this kind of competing idea around traditional ideas of gender, but then also this kind of increased engagement in different forms of caring practices. Alongside a lot of this work, there's been a greater attention to men and care, and there's a really interesting emerging literature around older men and men who provide care, who are more likely to provide care. So the men who receive the most attention in that respect, if you like, are men aged over 75 and caring for spouses. So I've worked a little bit with Christine Milligan at Lancaster University, written a chapter with her around aging masculinities and aging care there. What we've found particularly is because of that sort of the association of care more with women than with men, that those men tend to be more absent and less visible. So they're kind of caught again in these kind of competing relations around age and gender. And Sandy Ruxton, again another colleague at the Open University, in 2006 reported that because of that they're particularly invisible to welfare services, and they're not thought about in terms of how they provide particular care spaces or places to support them. So there's a real absence of those men and of consideration of their needs, if you like, in welfare services. A more recent literature that is really interesting me, and I think it's really helping me to make sense of some of the empirical data that's been generated, is around caring masculinities. And I'm trying to think about this in terms of how do we actually involve men in care? How do we recognise and celebrate men and the care that they do actually do. So of course there are gender divisions, and of course women are more likely to be involved in care, but what does it mean if we actually rethink masculinities as caring? What does it mean in terms of how we think about gender equality? And Niall Hanlon, he's Irish, isn't he? Ireland-based, I think, off the top of my head, I think Niall Hanlon is. And Carla Elliott have both published more recently about how we might theorise that. And they draw in an ethics of care perspective and argue that actually if we think about men being caring, what we do is we sort of think about masculinities that are challenging to dominance and are based on these more sort of relational identities. And what that might do is then try and redress some of those gender imbalances by involving men in care more. So again, that's a theory or conceptualizations that are starting to emerge that are really, really interesting to me at the moment. What I would argue is that there is very limited research on men from low-income families, and that includes kinship carer families. So my research with grandfathers was predominantly with middle-class, I'd say, middle-class men, men who engage in kind of a leisure-pleasure type grandparenting. So they care occasionally, they get involved in babysitting, they get involved when they're asked to, quite well resourced. But there's very little knowledge about men who are engaged in caring relationships when there's a real need to, or when parents are unable to. So that's kind of been my starting point, and where the kind of theories that I'm interested in thinking more about. Through my work around grandfatherhood, I've, as I say, contributed more to these debates around ageing masculinities. And I think, as I say, I was talking to Paula earlier, you know, this is a really, really underdeveloped, under-researched area, and there's real potential, I think, for really thinking about this a lot more. So Jeff Hearn, as I say, was one of the kind of proponents of this, one of the key initial thinkers about this. we ran a really interesting seminar at the Open University about ageing masculinities as well, trying to think about how we might theorise about it, how we might understand it. And David Jackson has also done some great work called Greying Masculinities, and he really looks at the embodied nature of being an older man, and how he really faces, or how he's dealing with the challenges of having a less able body as a man, and what that means for him. And one of the key arguments around this is that ageing masculinities are kind of paradoxical, if you like. They're described as paradoxical because of these interrelations of sexism and ageism. So on the one hand, they may benefit from patriarchy, from the privileges afforded to being a man, particularly over the life course, so an accrual of wealth, for example, particularly for well-resourced men. You know, even in terms of bodily changes, you know, so having grey hair might be seen as being a man or giving a man wisdom, whereas for a woman it might be seen slightly differently. So those kind of competing ideas have different, interpreted, if you like, in different ways. But then they may face disadvantage because they're older. And research around masculinities, particularly Cannell's research, very much focuses on younger men. And if we think about hegemonic masculinity, it's very much associated often with younger men. So older men have tended to be excluded and seen as less viable, if you like. So men are becoming more potentially become more marginalised by their age identities, but may still benefit. And Jackson argues that in terms of social constructions of hegemonic masculinity, it's very, very unable to deal with the contradiction and shifting realities. So it doesn't deal very well with change and with context. So that's some of the key arguments there. So as I say, that's my kind of context and my starting point. What I'd like to do now is just talk a bit more about my current study. So my current study is called Men, Poverty and Lifetimes of Care. And as I say, what I really wanted to do with this study is really think about men in low-income families and to really try and understand their experiences, what ageing masculinities mean for those men, and what patterns of care they talk about over time and across their life courses. So the study started in October 2014. I do it on a part-time basis, so it will finish in June 2018. And I've conducted a fairly innovative methodology to do this. And I think part of the attraction of the study itself was really making use of existing qualitative data, to analyse that and then to build a new study out of it. So my study is qualitative longitudinal, so looking at change and continuity over time. It's longitudinal because, as I say, I used existing data sets that were also qualitative longitudinal, so collected over time via several waves. And then I've done another empirical phase, and that's been very much informed by the findings of this secondary analysis. So to do this, I looked at two different data sets that are stored in the Timescapes archive. And I don't know if there's anyone familiar with Timescapes, just to get a sense.
We had someone from Timescapes, so we're speaking.
Oh, okay.
A couple of years ago.
Yeah. So it's a bit ESRC funded, large-scale study, consortium of research studies, if you like, with linked substantive interests around family, identities, relationships, generation, and there's some really great projects there. There were 7 projects in the original set of studies, looking at motherhood, fatherhood, grandparenthood, old age as well. So Joanna Bornat and Bill Bythway did a great study on the oldest generation, and all of that data is now available in an archive. And can be looked at, and I can't recommend it enough. It's been really difficult to do. There's a lot of debate around how possible it is to analyse data, qualitative data that you haven't generated yourselves. And me and a colleague, Karen Hughes, are currently working on that at the moment. We're really thinking through some of the challenges and complexities of doing that, and more than happy to talk to you about some of that work in the question and discussion section. But what I did, I looked at Tues data sets following young fathers. So I looked at young men, the study that looked at young men aged under 25, and looked at their care experiences and their interactions with policy and different services. And then a second study called Intergenerational Exchange. And this was a study of low-income grandparents in a very sort of low-income estate in a northern English town. Both studies were conducted in the same place, so there's a lot of crossover, if you like, in terms of the characteristics of the participants. And by bringing those data sets together, which again has had its own interesting set of complexities and dilemmas, I've been able to look at different intergenerational dynamics, how grandparenting, parenting, fathering, all those sort of things are done, and how they intersect and interact, and how they do all of this in a very low-income context. So in terms of today's presentation, I do want to just focus more on the grandparents. They're not, as I said at the start, they're not old by normative standards. So a lot of these grandparents are late 30s, early 40s. Really interestingly, when you read their sorry, yeah, so they're not, you know, the average age for a grandparent is 60, so you know they're sort of half that age. But in those low-income contexts, with these, they have lower life expectancies. You know, it happens a lot earlier, and the transitions, if you like, into these family roles are accelerated and much quicker. Intergenerational exchange, originally, it was run by Karen Hughes and Nick Emmel, who are based at Leeds. It wasn't actually intended to be about grandparenting. They wanted to see how you could access people in low-income contexts that have been described as hard to reach. And they just found these really high levels of kinship carer grandparenting in those areas, and then created this project around that. So what that study did was it investigated grandparents' lives and how they unfolded over time, and also what was mitigating against their efforts to change the lives of their grandchildren. And what they really found, and what's really important, I think, to talk about is that while the literature on grandparenting, on grandfathers, was very much based on a leisure-pleasure type form of grandparenting, these grandparents were really involved in rescue repair grandparenting. So they were stepping in, taking control of situations where their children were unable to provide care for their grandchildren. So there was these really different styles of grandparenting and different practices of grandparenting across the waves of interviews. So I got involved with this because I'd met Karen prior to getting the funding, and I was doing my research around men, and she said to me, we haven't done any analysis of the men. So they'd done a lot of interviews with the grandmothers. She did argue that when they went in and did the interviews, because it became about grandparenthood, the men felt that it wasn't for them. And some of them disengaged from the research altogether. Where there is data, it's really, really fascinating, and there's lots of lines of analysis that weren't followed up at the time. And one of the arguments for QL data is that if it's really well done and really well structured, it'll follow quite a tight structure and quite a tight set of questions. And for them, grandfatherhood and gender wasn't what they were particularly interested in. They were more interested in health inequalities and, as I say, these kind of exchanges of care between different generations. So there's a real opportunity that we managed to carve out and luckily get funded to really think about those men and what they were saying. Where there were gaps, so a lot of them, some of them talked about having previous partners and previous children and having to manage their money around lots of complex sets of relationships and trying to determine who they should resource, which children they should resource and which ones they couldn't. Those kind of questions weren't really followed up. So in my follow-up study, which I call MPLC, I asked those questions. So I asked them, you know, how did you make decisions around who you provide resources to? You know, what were your experiences with social services? Because they weren't asked in those interviews. So it's thrown up a lot of really interesting issues, and it's really helped me to kind of focus my interview schedules and to build out of this existing research, the research that I hadn't been involved in directly myself. It's a very strange experience reading someone's transcript when you've never met them, you don't know what they look like, and you have no sense of them. And actually, thinking about age and aging was really interesting, looking at those transcripts, because when I was reading them, I was thinking, you know, these read like the grandparents I was researching for my PhD, and then talking to Karen, she said, you know, they're like your parents' age. So it's really, really fascinating how that kind of distance and being disembodied from that data affects your perceptions, if you like, of who they are. So anyway, just to sort of bring a close or to summarise that. The value of this sort of qualitative longitudinal approach was very much to move beyond a snapshot approach of much research. So across the waves of interviews, you do see change and continuity. Things were happening very quickly in these contexts. In one interview, in one wave, grandchildren would be being looked after. In another, they'd have gone back to their parents. In another, they've got another set of grandchildren that they're looking at, and you see how they're working that out throughout the different waves of interviews. It also allows you to think about data from a temporal perspective as well. So through analysis, we can explore turning points, tipping points, but also, as Tues and Emma do say, things never changing as well. So while there is a lot of shift and continuity, a lot of them feel that they haven't really been affected by some of the big policy changes and the big economic changes that were going on at the time. They were doing interviews around 2007, so just as the global economic crisis hit. And one of the strands of interviews that was done across the Timescape studies was about how that had affected families. And many of them said, it's always been crap. We've always been like this. We've always been part of they don't say the core poor, but we've always been poor, and the recession has not affected us. So again, I've written a paper recently about that, about how my new set of data speaks to that and it looks at how austerity has really embedded or disadvantage and really reduced cuts and created hardship for families. And it is affecting these families a lot more. The lights have gone off. Should I wave again? So I've said that, so I'm going to move on.
Okay, sorry, the lights have gone off here. Apologies.
You've got my shadow in the mirror there in the window. So, oh, there we go.
Well done.
Having all the technology issues. So just to give a brief, I want to talk about some of the data now, because I think the data is much more interesting, and it speaks for itself a lot more, I think. So across both the two studies, so across the intergenerational exchange study and my new MPLC study, I interviewed men who were fathers and also, as I say, kinship carers as well. The fathers aged from 14 up to 73. I had a great-grandfather. So they were in a variety of different social fathering roles, if you like. I had men two men in my more recent study were fathers to, they had disabled adult sons, so they were kind of interested in care and masculinity in the way that the research was presented that way. I had single fathers, people in lots of different family circumstances and doing all kinds of different fathering, caring practices. And I interviewed 8 kinship carers altogether, and I accessed them through Grandparents Association in Leeds, which is where the research was based, which is no longer there anymore. It lost its funding when it merged with Grandparents Plus, unfortunately. So they were doing really great work in Leeds, providing support services and group work settings for kinship carers. As I say, I had to think about how I could bring the two data sets together and also how my study would follow on and whether that would be viable and possible. So all of the participants reside in Leeds, in the north of England, and recently a report came out by Ian White, who's based at Leeds Beckett, and provides an overview of the health of the city, if you like. And they found that in this city, 2,000 males are single parents, so there's a really interesting data about their care responsibilities. 6,000 are working age and provide 20 hours or more of unpaid care. And in this city, they're more likely to die young than women and live unhealthy lifestyles as well. So there's lots of drinking and smoking and all those kinds of things. So that's just a bit of context there to the demographic. So these are the men that I was accessing essentially. In terms of my emerging findings then, men were becoming carers for a variety of reasons. Very often they weren't the first choice to become carers. It might have been because of death of family members, which was quite a common thing across the interviews that I did. So death of daughters, usually in their 30s, So I had two daughters who died in 31, 32 with cancer for an awful reasons, really. I mean, one of them had been abused and had tried to access help a lot of times and just wasn't getting anywhere. So when she did have cancer, she wouldn't access health services, and it was too late, essentially. So she left 3 children behind. Incapability of female relatives. So if the men were separated, divorced, for example, they often reported that their wife or ex-partner couldn't take the care of the children because they had their own health problems, own ill health, so they were the most able-bodied and most able to provide that care. And sometimes, I mean, desire to do it as well. So I've got examples of men who are really fighting tooth and nail to be considered to be the carers. And there's some quite, again, I'll talk about this a bit more tomorrow, but some quite horrible stories, if you like, about men having to sort of fight every day to go to social services to say, look, consider me, I can do this, I want to do this. Others have made promises as well. So when people knew that there was going to be deaths in the family or things were going to be, they were going to be needed to provide care, they made promises and said, look, I will do it. So lots of different reasons why they've come to become carers at this point, at this later point in their life. And there's 3 themes. There's lots of themes, but the 3 themes that I wanted to talk about today, in terms of aging and in terms of their experiences of getting older and caring later in the life course. One is around reversals of gendered roles in the family. So again, it kind of aligns with the research around grandfatherhood, but it links into this idea about gender equality and how becoming a carer makes these men value and recognise what their partners have done in the past and what that meant for them. The second theme is around stress, anxiety and breakdown. So across, particularly actually in the intergenerational exchange study, there's a lot of examples of men breaking down and really struggling to cope with the taking on of children that they weren't expecting to. And that's linked into their identity and to their expectations about what it is to be a man. And I'll show you an example in a minute. And then a third theme around self-reflections on care and ageing. So, as I say, I didn't, in terms of my own study, I didn't go in really thinking too much about ageing in these contexts, but that data comes out and is very much there through their discussions. So those are the 3 themes that are starting to emerge for me at the moment. So my first example is Pierce. So these are all pseudonyms. Pierce was interviewed as part of my MPLC study. So that was in 2015 that he was interviewed. Pierce is relatively well resourced compared to some of the men in these families. His wife had always been looked after the children and didn't work, but then had got into a career later in life. He'd been a lorry driver for the majority of his life, and it was a job that he hated. He sort of found it really stressful and seen lots of things that he found very, very difficult. He and his wife end up taking on the care of 2 of their grandchildren. So they're a father and mother to 3 children, and then 7 grandchildren in total. But the son there's 2 daughters and a son, and the son was in an abusive relationship, and there was some neglect of the grandchildren. They were actually away on holiday when this all happened, and the children were taken into care, and they basically had to return from holiday and were given a couple of weeks just to say, look, can we do this? Are we going to take them on? And in this part of the interview and in this extract, he's talking about the decision-making around him becoming the main carer for his grandchildren. So his wife decided to stay at work. They felt that they could afford to do that, and he decided to leave his job. So I'm going to, yeah, don't worry, yeah, no problem. Yeah. So he says his wife was on it's in the Leeds accent, so I'm not going to try and do that. He says his wife were on a lot more money than me, and I was having a stressful job. So I'm quoting Pierce now. So I just said, right, I will jack it in. I look after the kids, but it were a massive learning curve because I've never done it before. I mean, when my kids were growing up, I were working on nights for 9 years, and I went full-time on days, but I never had to deal with small ones. At the time, my kids were 9 and 10 when I came off nights, so it were a massive learning curve for me and really, really hard. I should just say the grandchildren are 4 and 2. So again, just to get a sense of the age of the children. And I've highlighted this in red as well. He says, I can see what women sort of complain about when they've got kids around their feet all day, and it's nice when my wife comes home. We get these to bed and we can talk, and I've got adult conversation. It's really, really strange. So So again, I'm trying to think about this in terms of how gender divisions of labour are shifting over the life course. And I think this for me is a really good example of how his involvement in care and him taking on that care on his own while his wife is at work has really made him sort of appreciate, if you like, the unpaid labour that his wife was doing in the past, and you know, how difficult that is and challenging that it can be. It also resonates really strongly, I think, with this idea around caring being a gender equality intervention. And if men get involved in caring and they recognise the hard work that's involved in that and the challenges that are inherent in that, they've got this much greater appreciation. And he talks a lot about how, you know, that's really sort of solidified and strengthened his relationship with his wife, because they've got something to share, and they, you know, he's got empathy for what happened and what she went through when he was out at work for long hours. So for me, that was kind of a really interesting example of that. As I say, it's not all rosy, and a lot of the men, and not a lot of the men, but particularly the less resourced men, really did struggle with taking on these grandchildren, particularly when it wasn't a choice. This is Jeff, so he's 47. He was interviewed for the IG study in 2007. He's married. Both he and his wife are on incapacity benefits, a lot of ill health. They really struggle to access services. Their grandchildren were dropped off in the middle of the night in what's called a midnight drop. So they were like, the social services came and said, take them or we'll have to go into care. So they felt it was very quick. It was, you know, it was a difficult decision for them to make. They knew that there were problems with their daughter, but they didn't expect things to be quite so quick and so accelerated. So Jeff's a complex character. If you look at his interviews, if you look across the waves of interviews, you can see his narrative changing, and he eventually does get in contact with someone in the third sector who tries to change his way of thinking about this and change his way of, tries to give him a better perspective on what's going on. So he's really conflicted. He says, I was so annoyed at the time, so this is in relation to the midnight drop. He said, I could have put them in care, but I thought you can't do that. I've been in care. I don't want them to go through what probably I went through. I mean, don't get me wrong, I had what I remember being in care, a good childhood, but when I got, say, abused and that, so he's very conflicted about his own history of being looked after and of being in care. He's trying to make sense and justify why he might not want to provide care for those grandchildren. But as he says, it's a lot to do with his economic resources, and it's a lot to do with a loss of work identity. So they both leave work to do this. So he says, I know for a fact I won't work again. I won't work again now. I've worked all my life, and like I say, I had to give up a good job financially. I couldn't take it. There was so much pressure on me. The pressure, I mean, I admire any woman who will look after their grandkids or anything, but it's bloody hard work. Financially wise and everything else, it's tiring sometimes. I mean, especially obviously at our age, bearing in mind 47, it's not easy because financially wise. So there's so much richness in this. I mean, there's so much going on. I mean, again, he recognises what his wife must have been through in terms of providing care. But for me, if we're thinking about masculinity, you know, he's really tied up and caught up in this idea of having to leave his work and that kind of traditional idea of man as provider, and that's a real issue for him. Jeff had been violent in the past towards his wife, and the intervention of the worker in the third sector had really helped him to work through some of those issues. But as you can see, he's really sort of struggling and trying to work through some of those complexities. So my final example, this is for me one where this sort of attention to ageing, getting older, really starts to emerge. So this is Sam. Sam's 51. Again, he's kind of one of the less resourced of the men that I interviewed. Sam, this is quite a harrowing situation, really. So Sam's grandson, his son has learning difficulties, had a child who was born prematurely. He was born at 32 weeks, was in hospital. That child got released to the maternal grandmother, and she'd had 6 children removed from her in the past, and so the grandchild went to her, and he noticed things were not quite right with the baby once it had gone home, once it had gone back to the maternal grandmother's home, and eventually he presented with green stick fractures and signs of abuse. He was reporting this to social services every day. I'll show you the data tomorrow. But he was reporting this to social services every day and saying, there's something not right, I want to take on the care of that grandchild. And they basically said, no, go and get a lawyer, go and get a solicitor, go get somebody to go speak to somebody else. They didn't show much interest in thinking about him as being the potential carer. Eventually, when the baby did present with green stick fractures, they started to come round to his way of thinking, and he was saying, look, I want to look after this baby. But he had to go through a number of assessments because the social services couldn't prove that he hadn't been the one who had done that to the baby. So they were very careful, and that's obviously quite right, particularly with such a vulnerable baby. But so the grandson is now 4. He's been with Sam since he was 9 months old, and Sam really loves it. He loves it. For him, it's actually stopped him aging. So he says, I think with him, yeah, it's hard work, but it sounds funny this, it stops you aging. It definitely has, definitely stopped me aging. And it's not interfered with my work. So he does a bit of freelance work. His son is a boxer, and he does a bit of coaching boxing in the local community. He says, in fact, I've gone on now from thinking I'm going to be skint for the rest of my life, and I'm not going to do now. That's it, everything over, to now kind of achieved more since I've had him than I ever had. I said, so what's different about him from your children, would you say? And he says, well, no, I generally have achieved more. I think what it is with him, I've got more of a soft spot for him because of what he's been through. I'm very, very protective with him. During this kind of dialogue, he also compares himself to his brothers, who he says hang around in the working men's clubs in the local area. So for him, he's saying this caring role has been emancipatory. He says, I'm not sitting in these working men's clubs drinking and doing all these traditional masculine things. You know, he's getting such a lot, and it's really been an important thing for him, and giving him a new lease of life as well. So, just to sum up, I hope I've not gone too much over time or anything. I just want to say, I mean, men become kinship carers too, and that's perhaps, it is obvious, but there isn't much research around the particularities of being a man doing this kind of work, if you like, and this kind of care, this unpaid labour. It's not unpaid always, but it's not very well paid, particularly when it is. But it has implications for the reconfiguring, reworking of their identities in later life. So they do grapple with these new care responsibilities, these unexpected care responsibilities, and I think for me that's really tied on, and in terms of what they say, that's really tied up into these kind of traditional notions of what a man does and the relationship between work and care and how that's gendered. It can be, for me, an opportunity for redressing gendered inequalities between partners. There's a really interesting, again, a paradox, if you like. So, particularly in low-income contexts, we associate masculinity and being on a low income with violence, actually, and with responses that are potentially negative, that are, sort of self-harming behaviours or negative behaviours. And we're in an austerity context at the moment where we're expecting men to be ethically and morally, act a certain way and to provide care. So we're not providing the context at the moment actually for that care to flourish, and that's something I've been thinking through. But when it does work, then these men are starting to see that actually being involved in care is a positive thing. It's something that they enjoy, and it helps them to understand some of the gripes maybe that their partners had when they were working in the past. For some, I think it does ameliorate the sort of negative connotations of ageing. So I'm very conscious, and I had a really good feedback the other week actually about this, that they're very, the sort of successful ageing narrative is certainly there. They're really keen to show that they're good at this and that this is something that they are successful at. It's quite an individualistic way of talking, I think, about ageing, but also about the care that they do. So there are particular sort of gender ways in which that's happening. But for them, it can be a reversal of that. But for me, I think hardship is a real barrier. It's a real barrier, and particularly for these sort of lower resourced men, it can accelerate that feeling of ageing. And Jeff very much talks about that. He talks about being our age, as if you know, that he's much later in life. So I think we really have to think about those intersections and the complexities of those intersections, and think about class inequality as well as aging and gender, and how all of those things intersect and affect how these men are portraying and describing their experiences. So that's me.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.